Well, welcome to the Nihilo podcast. I'm your host, Eddie. We've got with us Josh Reich. Josh, how you doing, man? Nice to have you.
Good, man. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely, man. I read your book a little bit, read through that. Love your blog. Get the subscriptions in the email and all that. And so I wanted to have you on. But first, why don't you tell everyone who's not familiar with you, who you are and kind of your background.
Yeah, so I'm a pastor in Tucson, Arizona, and planted a church about 8 years ago with 11 people, and I've seen it grown over the last 8 years. And I'm a dad to 5 kids. I have 1 daughter and 4 boys, so we have just a loud house. We are constantly wrestling and playing football and trying to keep them from killing each other. And so I always we joke that we're kind of a beginning of a frat house because often we have to remind our boys to put a shirt on because people are coming over. So so our house is fun, keeps me on my toes, keeps me young. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about who I am.
How long you been in ministry?
Let's see now. So about 18 years. So started right my freshman year of college when I became a Christian, and got to intern at a really great church where I grew up outside of Philadelphia. So I grew up on the East Coast.
All right.
And, did student ministry for about a decade and kind of got my lumps, learned a lot, and moved to Tucson about 10 years ago to start a church.
So you've been the lead guy at Revolution. Do you call it Tucson Revolution? Is that what you call it? Or is it just
Revolution?
Revolution?
It's called Revolution Church.
Okay.
And started that. I'm the lead guy there. And I've planted a church. We're planting another one next year. And
Awesome.
Part of my role, too, is I get to oversee all the church planting for Acts 29 in Arizona. And so I get to do a lot of just coaching other leaders and pastors and just helping other churches. So.
Well, since you're coaching other leaders, I think our topic today will be quite appropriate. You're probably coaching, I'd imagine, church planners, so guys getting ready to dive into ministry and get their hands very, very dirty. You wrote an awesome book called Breathing Room: Stressing Less and Living More, right? So we're gonna really, I love the idea. Actually, I heard a friend of mine, my old pastor Ryan Hughley, you're on his podcast.
Yeah.
A year or so ago, heard you on his podcast, wanted to have you on, and I know Ryan's background and kind of how he's using some exercise and things to de-stress. And so tell me a little bit about, first of all, your story in writing the book, and then kind of the premise of Breathing Room.
Yeah, I mean, so my story, and really the book comes out of my story. When I got married, I was 300 pounds. And so had a 42-inch waist, wore a 2XL shirt. When I went back to log what I ate, I would average about 6,000 calories a day.
Wow.
I was just real unhealthy. And so probably right around the time that we were moving to Tucson, I was just utterly miserable. I was 28, felt like I was 50. I would just sweat at random times and just, because when you're just overweight, I mean, you're just hot all the time. And so it just became really difficult to lead and to live. And it was hard to get down on the ground and play with my kids when we were starting our family, and just became just utterly miserable and really just felt like something needed to change. And so bought a mountain bike because I was too overweight to run. It just hurt too much to run. So I bought a mountain bike and I bought some spandex that was too small because I wanted to I'm pretty vain. And so I wanted to be embarrassed when people pulled up next to me while I was on my bike and just seeing the fat guy in spandex and just really started to teach myself how to eat and to teach myself how to be healthy, because I just didn't grow up in a family that really taught me how to eat, that really taught me how to be healthy. And so then Breathing Room really came out of this journey of, in the first 18 months of our church, I lost 130 pounds and have kept it off. And so lost an entire foot off of my waist.
Wow.
Which is insane because it's essentially like a middle schooler that I lost. And so, and so really Breathing Room just started to come out of, as I dissected the things that I learned during that time and started to see, especially for church planters or entrepreneurs or just leaders in general, they just live at really unhealthy paces. They eat unhealthy. They miss out on things because of that. And ultimately then they're not able to finish in leadership or finish in ministry because they don't have the energy to do it. And so breathing room just came out of this idea that that oftentimes because we push so hard in life, we miss all the best things that God has for us in life.
That's, I mean, huge ideas there. I mean, I think I've been around lots of church planners, been in a few church plants, been in some established churches. I mean, this isn't something that's really talked about. I think burnout is talked about. I think people understand that burnout's possible, but the fact that your body is literally keeping you from doing what God's called you to do, that's a new idea. I think it's one that needs to be addressed, right?
I would absolutely agree. I mean, I get an email a week from a pastor wanting advice on getting healthy and losing weight. And what's interesting is that when I put all the weight on, so when I was in college, I played soccer, running 90 minutes in a soccer game. So, I mean, I was small when I was in college. And when I graduated and stopped playing soccer, I was on staff at a church and put on all this weight, and no one said anything to me about it. No one ever pulled me aside, say, hey, you're looking a little bigger. Is everything okay? And here's part of the awkward thing is that when you talk about your body, it's an incredibly awkward conversation to have with somebody.
Exactly.
Because our body is really our first defense. And it's a huge part of who we are. It's a huge part of our identity. No one's comfortable in their body. There's all kinds of things we'd like to change. And what was interesting when I got assessed to be a church planter, I had, just shared about, because we joined Acts 29, the church planting network we're in, about 2 years into our church plant. So I had lost all my weight at this point. And what was interesting was that one of the questions in the assessment was, how will I make sure that working out and the way that I look doesn't become an idol for me? And I thought it was interesting that no one ever had a conversation with me about putting weight on. It was all, well, let's just talk about how, that's not going to become your focus now that you've lost weight. And so there's just this really, I think, unhealthy view of our bodies when it comes to religion, when it comes to church and talking about it. And I think especially for leaders, because if you look at leaders, lead pastors who lead, effective churches, CEOs of effective companies, they're all in relative good shape.
Right.
So there is a connection, I think, to finishing in leadership, not necessarily being successful, but finishing and being faithful in leadership and your health. Like there is a direct correlation between those two things.
I'm with you. And, I'll be quite honest. This is probably my favorite podcast we've done so far because, this is essentially what ex nihilo is. I mean, for me, this is essentially the biggest issue is that, people especially in America, we're so dualistic with our bodies. Like we look at our bodies as like some sort of different idea. It's not connected to us spiritually or mentally. Yeah. And we can kind of just behave as we behave. And I've seen some stuff that, like you mentioned, kind of troubled me a little bit with ministry leaders and people, bloggers, and this thing where, we're almost celebrating the fact that pastors don't care about the way their bodies look because it's, the art of self-forgetfulness. But, that can turn into self-neglect. And I think you see that, right? I mean, you have a prime example.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I remember this was maybe about 15 years ago. I was with my brother-in-law, and he asked me how I can be a leader, be a pastor, and talk to people about self-control if I couldn't control myself when it came to food. And food for me became an addiction. It became a place of comfort. And now, it's not an addiction for everybody who's overweight. It's not an addiction for even people who are just slightly overweight. Sometimes there's all kinds of things that go into the way our bodies look or how food, attaches to it. And if we're able to lose weight, and thyroid issues and things like that. So, I mean, there's lots of things. I don't want to be simplistic about it. So there's lots of things that go into it. But for me, I mean, food was something that I just turned to when things were out of control, when I had a hard day. We even call it comfort food, and so I look to that, and I feel like a lot of leaders do that as well. And I was able to find safety in my weight. So when I was 300 pounds, if I got passed over for some kind of promotion at my job, or if I didn't get a job at a church, or if I wasn't invited to speak at something, I was able to excuse it as opposed to saying, well, I'm not I'm not talented or I don't have the experience for that, I was able to say, well, they just don't want a fat guy on their team.
Mm.
They just didn't want someone who was overweight. And so I was able to then not deal with some of the things or even grow in some areas that I needed to grow in because of my weight. I was just able to excuse it and say, oh, well, it's just because of the way that I look. And that's a really unhealthy place to be. And I don't think every person overweight does that. That was just what I did in the midst of my 20s when I was starting my career.
Mm. That's good. No, I appreciate you sharing that story, man. This is an angle that, we haven't even touched on yet, the angle of, making this kind of become somewhat of a crutch. Now, I know it's, cliche to kind of pick on people that are overweight, and that's not obviously, like you said, what we're trying to do here. But, our site focuses on primarily isn't necessarily the way you look, it's the way you're able to perform and feel. And so the opposite of being 350 pounds isn't ripped 6-pack abs necessarily. It's feeling and performing in such a way that's going to allow you to do what God's called you to do. And so can you actually reach the end is the bigger question. So
well, and I think one of the awkward things, especially as I've tried to share my story at my church or to teach on your body, and just because I feel like there's something really missing in the church culture of not having a healthy theology of our body and the idea of being made in the image of God. But one of the awkward things is that the moment you begin talking about it, everyone in the room just assumes, well, he's just talking to the overweight people. But the reality is that some people's bodies, like I have a good friend who eats a Taco Bell like 8 times a week and doesn't put any weight on whatsoever. He's just destroying his body by what he eats. But you look at him and you go, well, you know what? He's just an average, 39, 40-year-old guy, not overweight. He's not scrawny. He just doesn't put any weight on because of the way his body is. And so it's easy for us to just think the only people who have a problem with food are people who are overweight, but that's not actually true, because there's lots of leaders who are just naturally skinny, who are lagging in energy because of what they eat. They're just turning to monster drinks or whatever just to get through the day. They're not sleeping well. And they're doing they're doing the exact same thing as I was as a 300-pound guy, but they just don't look at it. And so it's this really hard place to talk about it, honestly, because of those things.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the touchy subject, right? So you speak at a church, or maybe you speak to a team of leaders, ministry leaders, and they all kind of look at the guy that's overweight as, okay, this is what you need to do. And clearly I don't need to do that because my body can handle it. But the truth is the same things are happening. This person's putting on obviously more fat, but there's some other physiological issues happening. You're going to have inflammation in your body. You're going to have propensities to have more heart attacks, diabetes, stroke. There's all sorts of things that are happening in your body. And so for me, and I think for you as well, the issue becomes stewardship. Are you stewarding your body well? In ministry, people are always talking about we steward our money, we steward our families, we steward our ministries. But for some reason, we steward our time, we steward everything. But when it comes to our body, what we do is we go to Revelation 19 and we look at the wedding supper of the Lamb, and we talk about God's going to celebrate, he's going to have a good meal, and food's created for good. And all true. But I'd imagine that Twinkies and Cheetos and Taco Bell won't be on the table when God prepares that meal, right? So
and the verse, in 1 Corinthians 6 is always just used to talk about, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, so don't drink and smoke, but have that third piece of pie at the church.
Right.
And so I think we miss that because when you think about, I think 1 Corinthians 6 is something that should really shape leaders as they think about how they sleep, how they eat, how they take care of their bodies, how they rest on the weekends, how they take vacations, the pace that they're living at, and think through how that verse helps us to steward our bodies, like you're saying.
So good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the fact that you're counseling some of these potential church planners, prospective church planners, or people that are already in the process. And, they don't see, and because this is the biggest issue that I see, I think, when I'm doing some coaching, they don't see this coming. They don't see this as a big issue because they've got to find a building, or they've got to raise money, or whatever it is, or building a team. And so how do you talk to a guy to help them make this a priority in their life? Because I know there's lots of guys out there that will kind of go, yeah, absolutely. But, we need this. So what do you say to a guy like that?
Well, I think, you just look around and you just see pastors who are quitting, who are burning out, who don't have energy. I mean, just, even hearing, recently Pete Wilson just talked about how he's just tired
Mm.
and he resigned from the church that he planted and he was just out of steam. And so you just see all of these pastors where that's happening. And I think one of the things that I talk with pastors a lot about is the goal of leadership is to finish.
Mm.
Like that's the goal of leadership. It's not, did I plant a church that grew to 1,000 people by the time I was 40? That's not the goal of leadership because
Mm.
lots of people do that who don't finish.
Mm.
The goal of leadership is to get to the end. And so when you think about it in those terms, now sometimes, I mean, I meet lots of young guys who, they're like, oh no, like, I mean, the goal is to build a big church. The goal is to, plant churches. And those are all fine goals to have, as long as they're not running your life.
Mm.
But, I mean, the goal seems to be in scripture of getting to the end and hearing God say, well done.
Mm.
Like you made it to the end. And so soon after we started our church, my wife and I had this conversation about, okay, what are some things that will keep us from finishing? What are some things that will make us hate ministry? I mean, because there's lots of pastors who don't like being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of pastors' wives who wish their husband did something different. And so we talked through how do we keep our kids from hating ministry? How do we keep our kids from hating the church? How do we get to the end in our marriage and our ministry so that we can make this run as long as it is? And your sleep, your food. I mean, and when I started to lose weight, I mean, my wife has been in shape her whole life. She's incredibly healthy. For me, it was just not that way. It was something I had to learn to do. But I started to see food as fuel for what I'm doing, for leading my family, and really changing my view of food. I think is a big thing that a lot of pastors have to do, because they just find themselves in these places where they're at lunch meetings. There's donuts at every meeting you go to for pastors.
Yeah.
There's all these huge things of pastries everywhere, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard to not eat those. You travel to a conference and you're just eating horrible food for you, and it's hard to have that self-control. And I think what happened to me is that, and I talk about this in my book a little bit, when I was 11 to 21, I struggled with a porn addiction. And what happened was I changed from porn to food. And a lot of pastors have changed from some kind of addiction to food a lot of times. And they'll feel better about themselves because it's not as bad of a sin in our minds.
Wow. That's a massive, while we're on the big theological, kick here, let me add to that and let me know if you agree or disagree with this, but it's very difficult. We always hear from pastors, like you just said, it's very difficult to do lunch meetings, breakfast meetings. You've got the donuts, you've got the big plates of pasta, you're doing these house visits or you're going to conferences and everyone's, wherever they're eating. It's hard. It's also hard to not lust after women while they walk down the street. It's very difficult to not get angry with your wife or your kids. It's very difficult to avoid things that do harm to your spirit, your body. It's very difficult. But we've bought into the idea in our culture. We're more like our culture than we think in terms of food, and we think that food's innocuous. You just got to make the right choices, but really you've got to work out. But hear me, it's also a theological issue. It's also an opportunity for the enemy to get you to stumble and send you down the rabbit hole in some of these issues and some of the way you're eating. And so if you're a pastor and you're listening to this, or you're a leader and you're listening to this, and you think food's not really that big of a deal, I think you might be wrong. I think you actually need to really consider whether or not food needs to be, you have to have some sort of food theology attached to the way you live your life. Do you agree? Disagree?
No, I totally agree. And I mean, I think too, one of the things that leaders really need to think through is everything you do as a leader either adds fuel to your leadership. Everything you do either adds fuel to your marriage, fuel to your relationship with God, or it takes it away.
It's good.
And so to think through, how do I add fuel to my leadership? Well, that means I'm not going to stay up and binge on Netflix until 1 a.m. as much as I'd like to.
Right.
I'm not gonna sleep until 10 a.m. I mean all kinds of church planners who are playing video games till like 3 a.m. and then they're sleeping in, and I think, man, like you're just killing yourself. Lots of guys who wear as a badge of honor, I worked 80 hours this past week. Well, that's not a win. How's that good?
Mm.
I remember when we made a vacation policy at our church, and I told our elders, I said, hey, however many days you give me, I'm taking all of them. So but so many pastors who, I was talking to a guy the other day who told me he has not missed a Sunday at the church that he works in for 2 years, has not taken a vacation.
Wow.
And I said, number one, you're not serving God well. You're not serving your people well. You're not modeling to them what it looks like to have a good rhythm. You're just killing yourself.
Wow.
And honestly, for that guy, he's afraid to take a vacation.
Yep. There's so many different ways I can go with this, but I'll go with this one first. The language in the scriptures that Paul uses about running the race well. There's this underarching theme of endurance that happens. And so if you've ever run an endurance race, a triathlon, something like that, you understand that you've got to fuel yourself properly along the way, but there's also pacing to your life that you've got to, there's some bursts where you're going to be able to go hard and then you're going to have to take it easy on others. And it almost seems like pastors are just like shotgunning monsters and thinking like this is a 100-meter sprint, but we're talking about an Ironman in ministry and in any really leadership position that you're in, whether you're CEO or whatever you are, it's a long journey.
Yeah.
What are people doing?
Well, and you just think too, because here's what's really easy to do is it's easy to get into your 30s, because I'm 37 now. So it's easy to get into your 30s and see people who in their 20s plant churches that are huge or start companies that just take off. And it's easy when you get to your late 30s to think, man, did I miss it? Did I miss my chance? Because I'm almost 40 and pretty soon I'm just not going to be a cool young leader anymore. And now I'm going to be over 40. And maybe I missed it. And so there's this pressure that we put onto ourselves. And one of the things that's been really helpful that I make every young leader read is a book called The Making of a Leader by Bobby Clinton. Yeah. And he walks through the stages of leadership. And he talks about how your first 10 to 15 years, there's almost no fruit. It's all about your character development. It's all about your inner life development. And that's where most guys into their 30s are. They're just into this character development season. And that your fruit comes in the second stage of that, usually like year 15 to 30 in leadership. Yeah. And then 30 and on is just this afterglow of you have just this, you're the Tim Kellers and John Pipers of the world where people are just coming to you and you're just, so much and you just ooze wisdom and that. But it's hard. Because you go to any conference and it's the successful people on stage and they're always young and hip looking. And so when you get into your late 30s, you just think, man, like if I don't push this, this boulder up the hill, it's never going to get there because pretty soon I'm not going to have the energy for it. And that's what I think drives so many pastors and church planters and entrepreneurs to really just burn themselves out.
Man, the expectations on people, right? It's massive. You see, and I think technology obviously has a lot to do with it. You're able to kind of become like a YouTube star, or you cut up your sermons on YouTube and Vimeo and Instagram, and you can kind of grow some sort of massive following at a young age. And so it's throwing pastors for a loop to who are forgetting. That it's a long, drawn out journey about sustaining yourself. And at the end of the day, we're seeing it left and right that you can't keep this breakneck pace. Pastors are burning out. They are frying themselves. But I want to connect this real quick. I want to connect, obviously we touched on the duality. We've got the spiritual here, and then we've got the kind of physical body here. But let's connect it a little bit in the way you've been talking to people and some of the wisdom you might have. And I'll read you this quote. So in case that my word, which it's not good enough for people listening, and your word that's not good enough, maybe there's pastors or leaders who want to hear from someone a little bit more wise. Sure. Martin Lloyd-Jones on the physical versus the spiritual says this: Does someone hold the view that as long as you are a Christian, it does not matter what the condition of your body is? Well, you will soon be disillusioned if you believe that. There are some in whose cases it's clear to me that the cause of their depression and anxiety is mainly physical. On the other hand, people who are more physically weak are more prone to attacks and spiritual discouragement and depression. But if you recognize that the physical may be at least partly responsible for the spiritual condition and make allowances for this, you'll be better able to deal with the spiritual issues. And so I want you to comment on that. How much of a factor is the way we eat, the way we work out, the way we take care of our bodies, and the pace we go at? How much of a factor is that on the actual, some of the spiritual things that are happening to us? Burnout, anxiety, depression.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge connection to those. I mean, because I mean, even just getting outside as a leader, just getting outside to take a walk, to just clear your head, and because something happens to all of us. For example, like when we're outside doing something active, something happens, and I mean, if you talk to a doctor, they'll tell you about all the everything that happens in your body when you exercise, and just all the benefits of that, right. And just and how that helps you to sleep, and how that helps you to burn calories, and how that makes you want to eat the right food, and those kinds of things. But there's a direct connection between those things. I mean, when we come back from a vacation, I mean, we feel good. We feel rested, and and if you do vacations correctly, even with young kids, you can feel those things. But I think for sure there's a connection because I think Martin Lloyd-Jones is right, that there's a connection to because I know for me, when I was overweight, I struggled a lot with just depression, anxiety, and it becomes this cycle then. It becomes a cycle that it's hard to break out of. Right. You're anxious, so you eat more. You're anxious, and so you have that dessert, and it makes you feel a little bit better at the end of the day. You're tired, and so you drink more caffeine, and you have more soda, and you put more sugar into your diet, and you just do those things, and it becomes this cycle that's incredibly difficult to break out of, especially because one of the things that I talk with people a lot about, because they'll say, well, what was the key to losing your weight? And I said, it was when I began to understand the connection of the spiritual and the physical, and I began to look at really what I thought food was doing for me, and then look inside of my heart. Because you can, I have lots of friends. You've probably seen lots of people, they lose 100 pounds and they put 120 back on. Yep. And they're just in this cycle because they haven't dealt with the root issues in their heart that has led them to see food as an addiction, food as a safety net. And so that's the first thing I always tell people. You have to figure out what is making you turn to food. What's the heart issues that you're running from? Yeah.
That's huge, man. The idea is just, I know it might seem a little nebulous to some people, but if we, especially in ministry, pastors are already in that world. We need to begin to explore this a little bit more. And we all have got these blind spots that we've got to be more careful with. And I think this is, in America, this has got to be one of the biggest vices. And, gluttony obviously being a sin, and it being almost an acceptable ministry sin in some circles. So real bizarre in a lot of ways.
It's funny. I mean, like I said, I get all kinds of emails from pastors. I'm doing a coaching cohort right now for church planters of churches under 200. And I asked them, they all filled out a form to say, what do you want to learn? What can I teach you in the next year? What would be the most benefit to you? Every single one of them said ways to get healthy.
So we're all dying. Okay. We're all dying from this. We all looking around, but at the end of the day, when we go to dinner with, maybe the Acts 29 folks are in town, and we, instead of having a salad, which we could easily do, or maybe have a nice lean cut of meat or whatever it is, we've got to go for the nachos. We've got to go for the beer. We've got to go for the soda. We've got to do those things because, it's, we're being hospitable. And so now we're manipulating some of these things so we can eat what we want. But if we get to the root of it, perhaps there's actually an eating addiction or a behavioral
Yeah.
addiction that's taking place.
Yeah. Well, and just practically, I mean, so some of the things that I always tell people, I never go out to eat without knowing what I'm going to eat before I get there.
That's good.
So every time I go to a restaurant, because the things that are good for me, they never have a picture of those in the menu.
Right.
And so, never go to a meeting without knowing what you're going to have to eat. If you're traveling, like I travel to speak a lot of times, I always have snacks with me. I always have good snacks with me, because when you get to a conference, they don't have good snacks for you. Like they have tasty snacks, they're just not good for you.
Right.
Thinking through some of those things. And it was interesting too. Tom Rath in his book, Eat, Move, Sleep, talked about when you order at a restaurant, you want to order first, because the first person at the table sets the tone for the entire table. So if the first person orders an appetizer, everyone else goes, oh, we're waiting to order our meal. Okay, well, I'll order an appetizer too. Or when they come around and say, hey, does anyone want dessert?
Yeah.
The first person, yeah, I'll have dessert, because this is the conversation. Well, who else wants dessert? We all look around, and it was funny, because I think it was a sportscaster who said, I was listening to a sports radio, and he goes, have you ever had dessert at a restaurant and felt good about yourself when you were done? He was like, no, you don't. Like, no one ever feels good about themselves after that, like, chocolate wall of cake or whatever, you get.
Oh, gosh.
And so, so just thinking through some of those things, that you can, and it was interesting too, when I was losing weight, that, salads aren't always the best thing on a restaurant menu for you.
Right.
There's salads at Chili's that have 1,600 calories in them.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by that. I thought, oh, salads are the best thing for you. And they're not always. And so just learning some of those things that, just asking people, doing some research. I mean, the trouble is there's just a bazillion things on the internet about food and what to eat. But when you just start to break down some of those things, you think, you know what, I can always go out to eat and know what I'm going to get before I get there. I won't even open the menu. I know exactly what I'm going to eat, so I'm not tempted to get something else. That's just a simple thing to do. That's something you can do everywhere you go.
So such good advice, and so down to earth for people to grasp. I would say, especially for leaders. Leaders are typically readers. They love to read. They love to understand. You wouldn't be in a race car in NASCAR and not understand the car and what's needed for the car. You wouldn't run a marathon without understanding what type of fuel you'll need to be successful at that. So do your research and learn the basics of nutrition. Don't rely on, Jillian Michaels, no offense to her, but don't rely on, The Biggest Loser for your eating advice, because it's sensationalized. And I would even say don't rely on, Chili's, menu to give you the best advice. Do your research and understand what your body needs to perform well, because if you want to be successul, you've got to do that. So, man, I'm going to come back to that and ask you for a few more practical pieces of advice. Yeah. But I wanted to touch on this real quick because I think I see this a lot. Especially in ministry and with leadership, pastors and their wives are kind of lockstep. And I've seen some guys, they're just studs. They're not going to go down. They can develop some sort of calluses when it comes to the way they eat and the way they move, but they move at such a pace. But sometimes the wife is the one that kind of breaks before the husband in regards to burnout, adrenal fatigue, stress, and diet. So I don't know what your experience is in that. Have you seen that? What advice would you have for somebody bringing their spouse along in this journey?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is I get a lot of questions, for example, from wives asking how they can get their husbands to lose weight or slow down. And I think, especially for women, there's just this real tension of, being the perfect mom and having everything together. And especially for a pastor's wife, as people are looking at her and the expectations on her, and especially a lot of church planters, they have young kids, and so they're in a chaotic stage of life when it comes to just what their kids need, what people in their church need, the expectations that they have on themselves. And so some things that Katie and I have put into place is making sure that she has an outlet to be active, whatever that means for her to be active. Like she likes to run. I hate to run. And so, but making sure that she has just time and space for that, making sure that she has a regular time and space for her to have. One of the things we try to do on 1 or 2 Saturdays a month is for her to just have 4 hours that are just hers, where she can go and sit at Starbucks if she wants. She can go hang out with some friends if she wants. It's not to run errands. It's not to get things done. It's just some space for her to get some clarity, for her to get some quiet, for her to just kind of pull back and journal, whatever she wants to do in those 4 hours. And so I think those are just some practical things that husbands can just do to love their wives, because one of the saddest things is if you, and you've seen this, if you don't take care of your marriage, you don't finish. Mm-hmm. Like you don't get to the end, no matter how talented you are, no matter how gifted you are, no matter how many books you write. If your marriage falls apart, you don't finish. And there's an enormous connection between how your home life is. I mean, Paul points this out all over in the New Testament, but there's an enormous connection between your marriage and your home life and your performance at work, whether you're in ministry or not. There's an enormous connection to those things. And so, being able to think through, because, the verses you talked about before of, running the race. Well, Paul talks about, I finished in 2 Timothy. I finished. And honestly, I can't think of a better goal to have as a leader for your job, for your church, for your marriage, to say, we finished.
That's good. That's good. We see these couples, 86 years old, 89 years old, been married 70 years. It's such an awesome thing to see. And, at the end of the day, if your wife doesn't finish, then you don't finish. No. So she's got to finish as well. And so there's this element of not only are you taking care of yourself physically, mentally, spiritually, but you've also got to be caring for her, and not just spiritually, but you've also got to set an example for her what it looks like to live out a healthy life, with relationship, in regards to relationships, in regards to eating and exercise and that sort of thing too. So,
well, and it's interesting too. I mean, if you look at leaders, the people around them, the people like on their staff, the boards that they work with, whether they're a pastor or, the leader of a company, the marriages and the bodies of the people around them begin to look like the leaders.
That's good.
So everybody, leaders do model. This is what your marriage should look like. This is how you should treat your spouse. This is how you should talk about your spouse. Like, here's a really quick example. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a sermon and I've heard a pastor put their wife down or tell a story that makes their wife look bad.
Wow.
And one of the things that Katie and I, my wife, we have a rule. You never make fun of each other. You don't put each other down. That's good. You've watched it when you're out with couples and they're like, just railing on the other spouse.
Yeah.
And you just watch them die. And a leader, especially a pastor, through how they take care of their bodies or take care of their marriage, they're telling the people in their church, this is what's acceptable. This is what you should do. Follow me as I do this. And pastors just, we split those up and we just say, well, I want people to have my prayer life or my, theological knowledge or whatever. But we also are passing on to them our marriage. And so like when I assess a church planner, I just tell them, hey, when you plant a church, you're going to get hundreds of your marriage. Tell me why that's going to be a good thing.
It's good. That's good, man. I love this advice. I love the cohesiveness that needs to take place in the marriage. And man, I've sat in those too, where you kind of rags on the wife and you're kind of looking over at her and she's just squirming over there, and you just can't be right. It goes both ways. We get it, but at the same time, you guys have got to be living your life face to face. So that me and my wife have the same rule. It's like we used to early in our marriage we'd struggle with we're ragging on each other. We're just friends, but it's like, hey, we've graduated from friends. We're not friends anymore. We're married. We're in a covenant. So. My wife to me is the biggest. She is the ultimate. When I'm around with people, there's no poor speech comes out of my mouth in regards to my wife. So it's huge. Great advice.
Yeah. Well, too many couples, their love language to each other is sarcasm, and it's destructive. It just is.
Oh man, that's brutal. Okay, so let's switch gears. We're getting towards the end of our time. I want to get real practical for anyone listening, especially if they're a leader or a pastor. First, talk to me a little bit about exercise. What some of the
Yeah,
things you're doing, and I know that there's almost a much bigger emphasis on exercise than there is for food. But for this sake, let's focus
sure.
on some of the things you're doing. I know you're doing CrossFit, and so what does
Yeah.
a daily week look like for Josh in terms of exercise?
Yeah, so I do CrossFit 4 days a week, and for me, part of doing CrossFit was part of just the next step in our physical journey, wanting to learn how to exercise. Because one of the things that I love about CrossFit is there's this real emphasis on teaching you how to exercise correctly.
Hmm.
Form. I know there's lots of CrossFit boxes that have terrible form and not good coaches, but there's more that are really good and know what they're doing. And so,
Right.
just wanting to learn how to exercise, wanting to learn, and especially for my wife too, one of the things that, as you get older, your bones just get more brittle, your muscles decrease. And so just trying to figure out, okay, how do we get ahead of that curve? How do we start doing some of those things? And so I work out 4 days a week. I'm lucky enough to work out with the owner of the CrossFit box, so I get to do his personal workouts, which are always insane and intense. But it's also just another great environment for just me to be on mission for Jesus.
Yeah.
CrossFit's got a huge emphasis on community and family,
Hmm.
and it's been amazing to see the doors that God's opened that way. I do run once a week, but that's not really for health. That's more of on Saturdays. I just run and I listen through the worship set that's going to be played at our church the next day and just think through my sermon. It's just kind of a way to clear my head and just pray through my notes and kind of focus on the coming day. And now that I'm getting older, I'm doing a lot more just mobility. And I know you just had an episode recently just about mobility, and
Hmm.
that's huge. I mean, if you're not stretching on a regular basis, if you're not doing some of those things, it's not going to pay off in the end.
Yeah.
And so that's just becoming a really big part of my week as well, of just that stretching, yoga, mobility,
Hmm.
doing some of those things. And so that's kind of like our normal rhythm for things. So I work out Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday and Friday.
It's good.
It's just the rhythm that I'm in now.
That's good. I think it was big what you said about too the box or the CrossFit boxes. There any good CrossFit box will have a way to integrate you in if you've never done it
Yeah.
or you're kind of new to it. And so don't be intimidating if you're new to working out or Olympic lifting or weightlifting and you're kind of nervous about it and you're
Yeah.
looking for a way to get started. Finding a good CrossFit box is actually a good way to get started working out, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah. And what's the name of your coach in the CrossFit gym you go to? Let's shout these guys out so we can.
Yeah, so we go to GTX in
Okay.
Tucson. So Sean Hazelton, he's probably got another shot at the regionals this year for the Open, and so it's exciting to watch. It's insane when you go to a CrossFit competition and watch what some of these guys can do,
Yeah.
and women can do. It's nuts.
No doubt, man. Yeah, our guy Tommy Hackenbrook is a
Yeah.
guy from Ute CrossFit up here. I go to his gym. Good friend of my old trainer Dan Cirillo, who's up in old former Navy SEAL and the whole deal. These guys, man, what they do, what they can do, they're special. He's been in the games, I
Yeah.
think 7-8 times, something like that. So again, there's good CrossFit gyms almost everywhere now. So
Yeah.
getting plugged into one of those could be huge. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're getting to the end of our time. Give me, as you're through your book, a pastor's listening to this, maybe a young leader, maybe a guy who's director level in his company working his way up. What are one or two or three things, man, they can do just health wise, whether spiritually, emotionally,
Yeah.
physically, that they can do that can be actionable, that they can do this week, that can help them begin the process of getting, more healthy.
Yeah, I think one is just making the goal that you're going to finish. Just make the goal that you're going to decide to finish. You're not going to burn out, and you're not going to eat so you have a heart attack when you're 40.
Right.
Just decide you're not going to do that, and that's going to make some enormous impacts on your schedule, on how much fun you have. I think for pastors, get a hobby. Leaders, most leaders have no hobby. If you ask pastors what do they do for fun, they have no idea. They read
Yeah.
books for fun. And I mean, pastors and leaders make terrible friends. Make some friends. I mean, most leaders have no friends. Pastors especially don't have friends. They don't know how to shut church off. They don't know how to stop thinking about work. And so those are some things that I think are really crucial to getting to the end. Some things when it comes to food and health. Like I said, going to a restaurant, know what you're going to eat before you get there. Understanding what caffeine does to your body. I mean, I know some people will tell me, I drink a cup of coffee before I go to bed and it doesn't do anything to me, and I can sleep. And I'm like, there's not one scientific thing that says that's true.
Yeah.
And so, just understanding what caffeine does to your body, cutting back on that. I think most pastors, if they cut back on their caffeine, they'd probably sleep a lot better. And this was really hard for me when I asked my wife the question. I just said, hey, do you feel like I'm doing a good job of sleeping? And she goes, no, you're not. And that was hard for me about 8 years ago, to realize that I am really harming our family and my job because I'm not sleeping well. So I can't give the best energy to what God's called me to. And that's a stewardship thing. If you're able to give the best energy. So, getting a good night's sleep. I mean, the horrible thing, the worst thing about health, burnout, food, exercise, any of that. The worst thing is everybody knows exactly what to do and no one does it.
Yeah. That's good.
I mean, everyone knows.
So
like
good.
When people say, oh, well, how'd you lose 130 pounds? I'm like, I started moving and I changed how I ate. And they're like, oh, really? So exactly what I would have to do. Yep. Like,
yeah, but something comes up, and then again, there's the men's breakfast with the donuts, and I mean,
so like with exercise. So when I started to bike, and even now today, exercise is on my calendar.
That's
it
good.
is on my calendar. It is the next thing that I do. So that when I did not feel like going to get on the bike, it was raining. Oh, it's raining, so I can't take my 25-mile bike ride today. It's raining out. No, I took it because it was 5 p.m. That was the next thing I was doing. And to just put it on your calendar. I always tell people, you have all the time you need to do everything you want to do.
Exactly.
I mean, you binged on Netflix, you have all the time you need. So
I got to tell this story real quick. So I just had somebody tell me, I run these Spartan races around the country, and I was running a Spartan race. I asked somebody, I said, man, you got to join me. Former athlete, college athlete, a while ago, but still. They said, man, I just don't have time, man. I'm working hard. And they kind of got a little upset at me, like, man, you just, and they're a little bit defensive, they'll be listening to this. They'll know who they are. So they're getting a little defensive. And then 2 days later, I'm sitting in their living room, and his wife looks at him and says, man, wasn't that awesome watching the Never Ending Story last night? It's been a while. And I look at him and I said, you don't have time to work out and train for a race, but you got time to rewatch the Never Ending Story? Are you kidding me? So at the end of the day, you make time. Man. You make the time for what you want to do.
Yeah.
You do. Yep. You've got the time. So real quick, you touched on something that's really interesting to me too, about pastors and leaders making friends. And it almost seems like, to me, I love your comment on this. So many pastors spend so much time trying to manufacture relationships and community in their churches or within their organizations, but they don't ever have an outlet for themselves. You find this happening?
Oh, yeah. I mean, pastors, by and large, are the loneliest people in their church, and a pastor's wife is even lonelier. They don't have a safe place to talk to. They don't have safe people to talk to.
Yeah.
They don't have anywhere to share their frustrations. I mean, how do you share your frustration as a pastor when you get mad at your elders, or somebody stabbed your wife in the back?
Yeah.
Every pastor and his wife has had this happen where they shared a prayer request with someone. They said, hey, we're struggling with this in our marriage, and it's spread everywhere. And so pastors and their wife, they just learn, to make it to the end, I need to protect myself and I need to not get close to anybody. But what that does is it actually keeps you from getting to the end. And so you have to make friends. And for pastors, I think some of the best friends that they can make are other pastors, whether that's in their city or somewhere else. I have a lot of friends within Acts 29 who I see, 3, 4, or 5 times a year. They're in different parts of the Western United States, and they're just a lifeline. It's so crucial for a pastor and his wife to have somebody that they can talk to, people, and even people they can have fun with. And so a couple of years ago, one of the things that I did was, on the advice of one of my mentors, is I asked one of our elders who I was really, really close friends with. And I just said, hey, a real ministry that you can do to our church is to just continue as a friend to me and my wife. Him and we're really good friends as couples. And I just said, what if instead of being an elder, you were just our friends? We were friends. We just hung out. We can turn to you. We can pray with you. And that's your ministry to our church. And it's a crucial ministry. Yeah. But it means you'll never be an elder. It means you'll never be somebody who oversees me. Mm-hmm. And he said, man, I would love to do that. I'd love to just be your friend. And that's a hard thing for some pastors to do, but there might be somebody in your church that you can turn to and just say, hey, you know what? The best ministry you can do to our church is to just be my friend and not become an elder, not move on the leadership track to plant a church, but to just be friends and have community. Because pastors know how to make it for other people. They just don't know how to make it for themselves.
Yeah. Man, that's such good advice. There's this disconnect because you're like I said, you're always trying to build something for your church, and so when it's a person, you're going, how will this person fit into my ministry or my organization? How can I fit them in? And just telling a couple or two to say, man, listen, you're talented, you're a great leader. I would rather just be able to go watch the UFC fight or a football game with you and have dinner and be able to just vent if I need to without having to worry about am I disrupting the flow of my ministry?
Yeah.
That's such good advice, Josh.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're out there doing this for people. I'm sure the people that you're coaching are glad as well. So, thanks. So we're at the end of our time. Tell the people listening or watching, where they can hear more about you and where they can get your book.
Yeah. So you get my book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, any of those places. You can check out my blog at joshuareich.org. Joshua Reich on Twitter. Would love to connect with you if there's a way that I can just help you and just help you get on track with health or avoiding burnout. Would love to do that. I write a lot about health and leadership and marriage and just how to make it to the end. And so that's really just the focus of what I talk about and what I write about. So if there's a way I can help any of your listeners, would love to be able to do that.
Awesome. I'm going to link all that in the show notes. So if you're listening or watching, for sure, check that out. You can hear more about Josh. And I recommend jumping on his email list as well. I get all his blogs right to my email. So super, super awesome for me to just click in and awesome. Get filled up, early in the morning or whenever the email pops out. So Josh, man, thanks for your time. I appreciate it, man. Love to have you back on soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie.